Chief Digital Safety Officer, along with Foreign Policy's Dr. Mayesha for a panel discussion on safeguarding lives and critical infrastructure in conflict.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be with all of you here in New York, and to our global audience, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really delighted to have an opportunity now to talk to two really incredible leaders who are trying to address some of the most pressing problems in our world, and that relates to how to protect critical infrastructure and civilians from cyber attacks and digital threats, especially at a time when the nature of war is evolving. Technologies are posing all kinds of new risks that have destructive impacts, but at the same time could be used potentially to address those challenges. And so let's dive right in, and I'd love to begin with you, Cordula. You are the Chief Legal Officer at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and are at the helm of virtually everything that relates to how IHL is operationalized and implemented. So just to get us a common understanding, can you help everyone understand what is the digital emblem? Like, what are we talking about when we say that, and how can it be operationalized in accordance with international humanitarian law in conflict settings?
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross to take part in this panel. So to start with what the digital emblem is, let's start with what is the emblem of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So in armed conflict situations for about 160 years, since the late 19th century, you have, and you've all seen this, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent emblems. And in conflict situations, the Geneva Conventions, which regulate the conduct in war and are the rules of war, the Geneva Conventions foresee that entities and hospitals and military hospitals and civilian hospitals, as well as humanitarian organizations of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, can bear the sign of the emblem of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and this sign signals that they are protected against being attacked in armed conflict situations. So you cannot attack a hospital, and the emblem just shows this is a hospital, you cannot attack me. And nowadays, of course, in armed conflicts, we have more and more digital operations, cyber operations that disrupt or even destroy infrastructure through cyber means, and not just by dropping bombs on them, for instance. And so hospitals can be disrupted, first aid stations, the work of international organizations. We have very sensitive data on missing persons, on detainees, etc. And these things are vulnerable to cyber operations. And so the idea is to transform this emblem, which exists in the physical world on the roofs of hospitals as well, to be a watermark, as it were, for digital infrastructure of hospitals and humanitarian organizations that are protected. So that's the idea of a digital emblem. It's a digital watermark to signal what is already protected by the Geneva Conventions in modern conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, and I think that really helps folks understand what exactly we're talking about. And your last point, I think, is one to really underscore, which is what is already protected under international law, right? But how do we make that happen, and what does that actually look like when we think about the technology involved? And Courtney, you are head of digital security at Microsoft, and so many of the world's applications and functions, including public services, run on Microsoft platforms. So tell us a little bit about how Microsoft has engaged with the ICRC and other partners when it comes to advancing this idea of the digital emblem, and how does that fit into your broader work as relates to protecting civilians and critical infrastructure during armed conflict?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for inviting Microsoft to join this conversation. And I'll put this a little bit in context from how we observe really the global threats in this space. Microsoft has a unique surface area in which we see the line between peace and war in the digital environment really blurring. We see over 340 million cyber attacks a day, and that is across the ecosystem. And we are honestly constantly monitoring over 300 named threat actors on a regular basis. Let's put this in the context of armed conflict, if you will. Cyber operations are really oftentimes the core of those modern conflicts. If we look at Ukraine alone, in February 2022, massive hacker attacks really accompanied the first missile attacks of Ukraine. And those hacker attacks targeted critical infrastructure in Ukraine, state bodies and their digital footprint, mass media, financial institutions, and many commercial services as well. On their main websites, what did that mean? If you went there, they saw literally Z propaganda, lay down your arms, on the state-sponsored Ukraine websites. So we see this threat environment and understand from a digital space how we've thought about preserving information ecosystems before. Many of you in the room probably understand that a critical digital lock when you go to your financial website that gives you a sense of security, but behind that, we think of the need in this space about how we take the lessons learned for hundreds of years about marking critical infrastructure. And we know the implications it would have to address the cyber threats. We need to pair that up with those like Microsoft who are constantly thinking about the monitoring the threat ecosystem and leveraging that information to continue to secure and harden our digital spaces.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's really, really instructive, and in particular, the examples that you shared from Ukraine and many other contexts. You know, as you were saying, the impacts are not just disruptive, but they can be destructive. They can lead to lives lost and very real damage done, both to humans as well as to you know, institutions and to infrastructure. Staying on this theme of, okay, we are trying to build buy-in for this idea. It's already rooted in international humanitarian law, but taking it a step further and being able to implement it and put it into practice. Cordula, let me ask you this. Why are standardization and integration so important for the digital emblem? And how are you working with governments, with the tech industry, with civil societies, or other humanitarian partners in order to be able to move this work forward?
So you need standardization because, of course, the internet runs on all these interconnected devices. And they don't necessarily communicate all in the same way. And so you have standardization in order for these different devices to actually sort of speak the same language, as it were. Because unlike in the physical world, the internet presupposes that you have the same language across those devices and that they are able to communicate with each other. So that's why you need a standardization for a digital emblem so that it's recognized and the same across the board. And integration, what we mean by integration is the integration of the emblem into international law, in particular international humanitarian law, because as I was saying before, the emblems in the physical world are integrated into the Geneva Conventions. They're protected by the Geneva Conventions, and the Geneva Conventions require all states in the world are parties to the Geneva Conventions. And so states are required to respect these emblems, but also to protect them in their own jurisdiction, to prevent abuse of these emblems in their own jurisdictions, etc. And so, you need an international treaty in order to agree on the rules that govern this emblem. And maybe to give an image that a colleague of mine uses, if you imagine a country with busy crossroads, right? And each intersection has stop signs. Now, imagine if there were no laws regulating what a stop sign actually means. Or no laws preventing anyone from placing the stop sign in random places. So you need agreement on what does the stop sign mean, where can it be put, etc. And the same thing for a digital emblem. You need agreement about what does this emblem mean for everyone, and what are the rules that everyone has to respect for a digital emblem. And so in international humanitarian law, you have several ways of doing so, and this is one of the things that we're currently discussing with states of what are the avenues for them that they could consider. So for instance, there are additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, and you could just do an extra additional protocol about this emblem, and then you would have, and a protocol is the same as an international treaty, and so states would ratify this treaty and say, okay, we agree that we will recognize this emblem, we will use the same emblem and the same way the emblem is done in the internet, and we will play by the rules.
Yeah, and so much of what you said, Cordula, really emphasizes the role of states, and in particular state parties to the Geneva Convention and more broadly the international community coming to consensus on this. From both of your vantage points and the work that you do, can you share some examples of kind of what you see as the role and responsibility of governments? And are there any examples from of attacks either on hospitals or ports where you can draw lessons learned from, that you have observed and addressed in recent years? Maybe Cordula, I'll come to you first and then to Courtney.
Yeah, so perhaps to go back a few years when we first, observed more and more cyber operations appearing in armed conflict situations, we didn't know yet what could be the consequences of such operations. And from a perspective of a humanitarian organization, you always start with what is the human cost of the weaponization of anything. So any new weapon or any new technology used in armed conflicts will have a human cost for civilians in particular. And so we were looking at what is the potential human cost. And of course, the thing that comes to mind to you immediately is, cyber attacks on dams or nuclear power plants, etc. Sort of horror scenarios which are possible, but which we haven't seen yet, fortunately, or at least not with terrible consequences. But when we started analyzing this and asking, experts about it, one of the things that became very clear very quickly was that, in particular, security people from medical institutions, hospitals, etc., were explaining to us that the digitalization of medical services had gone very fast, but wasn't really followed with the same security infrastructure. And so they realized that hospitals were quite vulnerable, actually, to cyber attacks and cyber disruptions. And this was borne out actually then during COVID, which wasn't an armed conflict situation, but still during COVID, we saw a lot of attacks on medical infrastructure. And so we realized that that was a particular vulnerable sector. And then we saw, but this is actually a sector which in armed conflicts is protected by this emblem, and is in general protected from attack in armed conflict situations. So how can we work on this to improve the situation?
Yeah, no, that's really important. And of course, it's not just hospitals, right? There's so many different types of critical infrastructure. Over to you, Courtney.
Yeah, I'll extend in the healthcare space because we did have the opportunity as Microsoft to partner with ICRC during the pandemic and really understand. I will bring the analogy full circle. Obviously, if we think about how financial institutions understood that they were a critical threat for cyber attacks because of the monetary incentive, you quickly saw, decades ago, the need for a chief cybersecurity officer within a financial institution. That is not how the healthcare system is structured, and they haven't invested in that way. We see over the landscape, and we did a survey in this in 2023, that actually the healthcare institutions are the most likely critical infrastructure to be attacked by ransomware, up 130% year over year. So Microsoft has been thinking about this really holistically. We this year announced our Rural Hospital Initiative, focused on in helping cybersecurity with those rural hospitals. That means training, technical advice, in addition to low or free technology to critically do that space. But I think the recognition that there needs to be an understanding that is a no-go zone, we could all understand, for offensive cyber attacks. How do we build an international standard to do that is critical as we help build the capacity of those institutions. You ask about other critical infrastructure, and actually, let's talk about the human cost of that. I think you can pick up the paper and you see what happens at hospitals when they are brought down by a ransomware attack. They talk about the delayed access to blood transfusions, to surgeries, and what that means for the real human impact. On other critical infrastructure, we're seeing ports hit pretty regularly. I used to have the pleasure of serving as a commissioner for the Port of Seattle. A ransomware attack just 2 weeks ago took down the infrastructure for 6 days as the airport tried to figure out how to get back online. And so we need to be thinking about critical infrastructure all up, but it is unique how the healthcare sector is vulnerable and deserves our protection.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, the examples that you shared really illustrate that this is a global problem, and one that is affecting countries that are both experiencing or emerging from armed conflict, but also those that are not, and increasingly becoming almost a tool, a geopolitical tool, in lieu of, kinetic operations, right? And that's also a really important challenge. So when we think about where do we go from here, we're here on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, the Summit of the Future is happening, and I know you're working to build momentum around these issues. And so let me ask you this, what is it that you would like to see going forward in the coming months, in the coming weeks, and going into the new year? What are the most important critical steps that need to be taken in order to really make that digital emblem, as you said, universally accepted, universally recognized? And what are you anticipating as the biggest challenges? And so maybe, Cordula, I'll come to you first and then go to Courtney.
Okay, so we continue to work with many different partners, of course, governments, universities, academic institutions, to develop the emblem technically, but then also to think in policy terms, how can we achieve agreement on the emblem? And perhaps on the substance, we need to come to agreement on the legal requirements. I think that's not a big hurdle, because in a way, they derive from the legal requirements that you already have in the physical world. So, it has to be trustworthy to be effective. So you need agreement by everyone. And it can't be used to fake protection, for instance. It also requires that it is only used, and this is also foreseen in the Geneva Conventions, when it has the authorization by the competent authority. So, this is how it works with the emblem. You have to have the authorization of the competent authority to be able to bear the emblem, and that's the parties to the conflicts and states that give this authorization. Then you also need a requirement that the emblem has to be able to be removed at any time, because things can, depending on whether they're in armed conflict situations or not, and depending on what functions they fulfill, they can be protected or not. So you have to be able to remove the emblem, including in the digital space, which is, I think, fairly easy to achieve technically, not that I understand anything about the technology of it. And then perhaps a bit more, which you might be a bit more surprised by, but actually makes sense when you think about armed conflict cyber operations. It requires technically that you can also identify it and inspect it when you're doing a covert operation, because of course parties to conflicts do covert operations to sort of look at what can they target and what can't they target. And of course, if they were immediately identified, they wouldn't be able to do this. So that's another technical requirement that we need for this digital emblem. And so with all these requirements, what we did after careful consideration and after, exploring several options was to focus the work on the authentic digital emblem, ADEM, which essentially uses certificate chains to signal protection. And so for the digital emblems, the certificates would be used to mark the digital infrastructure of these medical facilities and Red Cross, Red Crescent organizations and their networks and their devices. And so that's the sort of the technical next steps. And we're working on those technical next steps. And then we are also working on the policy and legal steps. And we have in October a big conference called the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which brings together states and national societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. And that's, for instance, one of the instances where we will discuss the digital emblem and sort of try to move the conversation forward, so that hopefully in the next month or couple of years we can move towards such an emblem.
Great. And Courtney, from your perspective?
You know, I think you have the harder job here, let's be honest. You articulated, Microsoft is proud to be a technical advisor in the development of this, but the technical standard is achievable and has been done in other contexts. So we continue to want to collaborate and support that, recognizing the opportunity for governments to make sure they're buying into the legal framework is that critical hard work. One extension of this comment would be the need to continue to monitor the technical environment with the digital emblem. We are very early days talking about what it means to think about content provenance and watermarking in the era of AI holistically. How do we have the opportunity as the average person to look at our information ecosystem and understand, am I looking at AI-generated content, or am I looking at a different type of image or other audio, etc.? We will be learning lessons from that space that are very applicable here. And one of the lessons that we know as we advance towards a standard in Microsoft, pushing very much for a standard for content provenance in the AI space, we're going to need legal frameworks to support that those that intentionally manipulate content provenance and metadata behind it have legal consequences under their nation-state laws. So I think that will be a continued space and overlap here to extend and continue to make sure that there's resilience.
Yeah, and that last point is such an important one, because it's going to require industry-wide cooperation and collaboration, right? Microsoft is at the forefront of leading much of this work and supporting it. But in order for it to actually be universally accepted and to be operationalized, it's going to have to be really a wide ecosystem of actors, or wide range of actors. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask you one more question, which is, you have been confronting so many different types of digital threats and cyber operations within the context of hybrid warfare. And, Ukraine's come up a few times, but it's not unique to Ukraine by any means. What do you think is the most important lesson learned in terms of building that resilience, Courtney, that you were talking about, to the types of threats and operations that you're seeing? And so maybe, Courtney, I'll go to you first from your perspective, as Microsoft, and then Cordula from your perspective when it comes to IHL.
My first thought is, one core principle as to how Microsoft wants to advance this conversation is very much being transparent about the prevalence of these cyber operations, to the best that we can, the nation-state actors that we identify behind them. And Microsoft consistently releases our threat intelligence in this way transparently, publicly, because of the conversation we're having here right now. This is not a only state actor to state actor engagement anymore. The need for broader awareness across critical infrastructure. We will continue to monitor these, transparently make them everyone understand what this means. Now we get to what is that resilience moment. And I think we are having a conversation across all critical infrastructure, the need to think about cybersecurity at the core of that operations. Now, how do we do that in a economically appropriate way is that critical next step. So what is the opportunity to bring that not just to rural hospitals, but really globally, what it means to be able to think about cybersecurity resilience and understand that. We build it back into our products. We share the information so the ecosystem can do that. But yes, a hospital administrator needs to be thinking top of mind, how are they going to protect their critical infrastructure as well?
So back to conflict situations, right? And when you ask what are the most critical threats, and it won't surprise you that when you look at conflict situations, the most critical threat is always that it affects civilians. In the physical world, you see this very clearly, right? And we have this core principle in international humanitarian law, which is the principle of distinction, which requires that military attacks can only ever be targeted at civilians and at military and military infrastructure, and not at civilians and civilian infrastructure, right? This is the core principle of all the rules of war. And the specificity, of course, of the digital space is that very often civilian and military infrastructure is intertwined. And so I would say what needs to be done is segregation, segregation, segregation wherever possible. This will be the best way to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict situations. So for instance, whenever possible, and of course there are technical and economic considerations here, but whenever possible to separate, for instance, if you have data on a cloud, separate the medical data from military data, for instance. This will be a key way to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure from being really affected in armed conflict situations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. I mean, this is such a complex issue, and I feel like we've only just barely scratched the surface of it. But so urgent too, and one that really is going to be shaping the perpetuation and resolution of conflicts worldwide. For those of you who are interested in learning more on this topic, we at Foreign Policy, and in particular FP Analytics, which is our independent research division and the team that I lead, have been partnering with Microsoft and ICRC and others now for a number of years on a multimedia project called Digital Front Lines. And we've had contributions from the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber in the US, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, and Cordula, among others, who've contributed perspectives on how do we actually deal with and address and protect civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure in this time of hybrid warfare. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's digitalfrontlines.io. But thank you both, Cordula and Courtney, for being here and for the work that you're doing. And I wish you success as you navigate this very complex but important issue. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.